Member for Victoria Beacon Hill.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and I'm proud to rise and take my place to speak to Bill 24 and the challenges that I see with this bill. You know, it's interesting, Honourable Speaker, when I take a look at legislation that comes forward to this House, I usually take a look at it within a frame. There are usually 2 or 3 questions that I always use when I take a look at legislation that comes forward, and no different for this piece of legislation. And I'm sure for those who are listening, they know, but this is the Agricultural Land Commission Amendment Act. And so I always take a look first to say, what's the purpose of this bill? What's the purpose of this piece of legislation that's come forward? Then I usually take a look, Honourable Speaker, at what this bill may be looking to fix. Because often when legislation comes forward to this House, it's coming forward to fix something, to fix a problem, to fix a challenge, to fix an issue that's occurred. And that's usually why you see legislation often introduced into this House. The other reason that legislation often comes into the House is it improves something. It comes forward to make something better, to strengthen something, to acknowledge something. And so I often take a look at legislation to say, is it something that improves it? And so I think I'll come back to those 3 questions, Honourable Speaker, because I think it's, as I said, critical to take a look at some kind of framework when you're looking at legislation. So if we look at the subject of this legislation, in this case, obviously, the Agricultural Land Commission and bringing forward amendments to the Agricultural Land Commission, I think the first thing we want to do is take a look at the history. Honourable Speaker, I think, you know, it's a well-used phrase that if we don't learn from our history, we're likely to repeat mistakes. I think that can work both in the pro and the con. It's important for us to learn what doesn't work, but it's also important for us to learn what's worked in history, what has been successful in history, as well as the challenges for all of us to learn from. So I want to start there, Honourable Speaker, to talk a little bit about the Agricultural Land Commission itself, the act that, as I said, this bill proposed to amend. The Agricultural Land Commission Act came into effect in April, so it's been almost exactly, if we take a look at the dates, 41 years ago, in 1973. And I want to read its primary purpose because I think, again, it's really important to take a look at the act that's going to be amended. What was the act brought in for? Well, Honourable Speaker, its primary purpose was to preserve agricultural land and to encourage the establishment and maintenance of farms. So it's interesting, Honourable Speaker, if you take a look at that purpose, just as relevant today as it was when the act was brought in 1973, I would suggest. Just as important today as it was 41 years ago. And what was the context of the time? Why would the legislature and the people sitting in the legislature back in the 1970s, why were they looking at the issue of agricultural land? Why was it important, and why did it end up as a priority in this legislature? Because as we all know, those of us who sat in this House for a few years know, Honourable Speaker, that priorities and the number of issues of legislation could come forward at any time. There are always competing demands. There are always many things that people are looking for to bring forward and to get on the front of legislation. And in this case, back in 1973, in this case, Honourable Speaker, we actually saw that the government of the day believed that it was important to bring forward the issue of agricultural land. And if you look at the context of that time, Honourable Speaker, building up to this act, there was a great deal of pressure on farmland. It was a time in our province that you were seeing huge pressure for development on farmland, for residential and business development on farmland in the early 70s. And it was also a time where we saw a real growing environmental movement across North America, not unique to British Columbia, but across North America. So I think it's interesting, Honourable Speaker, if you take a look at that context, that again, that context from over 40 years ago is just as important today, just as critical as today, and in fact, fits the context, I would suggest, of today that we're looking at. Growing pressure on agricultural land, growing pressures around development, and a strong environmental conservation movement that was important. The agricultural land during that time period in the early 70s, Honourable Speaker, was also a hot topic during the election campaign, which I think is interesting for all of us to be thinking about. The year before the act passed, the year before you saw government come in, you saw 3 political parties running at the time, Honourable Speaker, running to protect farmland. Again, if we're taking a look at the last election, I didn't hear anybody stand up and say that they were looking at taking apart the Agricultural Land Commission. I didn't hear the government of the day now, political party then running in the election, say that that's what they were interested in. In fact, I heard political parties saying that they supported the Agricultural Land Commission and supported the protection of agricultural land. What did the act of the day do? And again, this is looking at history related to Bill 24, Honourable Speaker, because again, if we're going to take a look at why this act should be amended, it's important to look at the history and important to take a look at what we're amending in this current act. That act back in the 70s put in place the Provincial Land Commission, which was a 5-person body, which was designated with looking at agricultural land, reserve sites around the province. This is a province-wide body, and I'll come back to that again, Honourable Speaker, because I think it has significance in the kind of amendments that are going to be looked at. So a provincial-wide body. I also think it's interesting, Honourable Speaker, to note that this body, in the original legislation that was brought in the 70s, was also responsible for hearing proposals to look at taking land out of the agricultural land reserve. So they did provide an opportunity in this bill, Honourable Speaker, for exceptions. For exceptions when there were cases that could be proven, when people had come forward, when the research was done, when the provincial body took a look at applications that came in, they could take a look at non-farming purposes and exceptions if the case was made to the provincial body. Now, I think that's very interesting to note in the legislation, Honourable Speaker, because I've heard a lot of rhetoric from the other side about the fact that there is no opportunity for land once it's designated as part of the agricultural land reserve, that there's no opportunity for any kind of reasoned argument or debate coming forward or rationale to come forward, and that's what this bill is bringing in. It's providing an opportunity for that rational argument. Well, I would say, Honourable Speaker, that looking at the history, if the government had taken time to look at the history, they would in fact see that there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity, in fact, to look at those extreme exceptions. I also think it's interesting, Honourable Speaker, one of the other areas that I've heard great debate and great calls for from the other side is that this is simply partisan politics. That those of us on this side of the legislature, New Democrats, because it was a New Democrat government that in fact brought in the legislation, that I've heard some members on the other side say that this is simply partisan politics, we're simply protecting something that we brought in as New Democrats, and that it's simply partisan politics that's being played here. Well, and I'll talk a little bit about public support and other support as we go on, Honourable Speaker, but I think it is interesting to note again that this legislation, the original legislation, came in the 1970s and was in fact supported by New Democrats, by Social Credit, when the Social Credit government came in, and then another New Democrat government. And until now, until the BC Liberals, we've in fact seen this act kept in place. Kept in place, Honourable Speaker. And I think that says something about not only the public support for the ALR, but in fact, different governments of different political stripes who've come forward and supported the ALR. And there's no question that there have been attempts to make changes, Honourable Speaker, that there have been suggestions around weakening the legislation, about changing parts of the legislation, But ultimately, until we see this bill, until we see Bill 24, we've seen the original legislation pretty well stay intact, which I think, again, speaks volumes to the support that we see around the key purpose of the Act, which you'll remember is to preserve farmland in BC and to encourage farming. It's interesting to take a look at public opinion over the years, Honourable Speaker, because I think, again, I would certainly expect when legislation has come forward that there's been good dialogue with the public, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along, but there actually was a public opinion poll done in 1978, and it found that 80% of BC landowners saw protecting farmland as a plus. They saw it as important, Honourable Speaker. They saw the value this legislation had brought in, and they saw the value during that time period. And then we move ahead to the late 1990s, 1997, when a survey was done again, asking the public in British Columbia how they felt about the Agricultural Land Reserve and protecting farmland. And that poll found that 90% of British Columbians wanted government to protect farmers and to protect farmland. So again, looking at the history, Honourable Speaker, looking at the history of this legislation and the bill that we're here debating, it's very clear that the public then, back in the 1970s, and the public now want to see agricultural land protected. They know that once you lose this land, you don't get it back. They know the value of this land now and for future generations. And this isn't unique to British Columbia, Honourable Speaker. We are not unusual in taking a look at farmland and protection. In fact, before the bill, the Agricultural Land Commission bill, was even brought in the 70s, you saw Hawaii, for example, create a land use law. And that law was charged with regulating how rural and agricultural land could be used. So again, in the same kind of time period, you saw Hawaii recognizing the pressures that was coming around growth, the critical nature of protecting food security, and they brought in a bill that actually looked at regulating agricultural land. In 1966, and I'm sure most members in this House would know this either from history or otherwise, the Williamson Act in California came in and limited development on farmland. Again, another jurisdiction taking a look at the importance of protecting that farmland and bringing in legislation to do just that. In the late 1970s, in Quebec, we saw the Quebec officials actually contacted BC and asked our commission, the new legislation that I talked about, asked our commission for advice on how to create their own act to protect farmland. And in Ontario, you saw some Greenbelt legislation passed, again protecting farmland from further urban growth. And again, that example as well, they looked to British Columbia because they knew we had done something right here. They knew that something important had happened in British Columbia, and they wanted to look at how they could provide the same kind of support to farmland and agricultural land in their jurisdiction, Honourable Speaker. So we know that the purpose of the Agricultural Land Act is just as sound today as it was in 1973. We also know, in looking back at history, Honourable Speaker, that the public, in fact, is more supportive today than they even were in the 1970s. The public opinion actually shows that the public feels stronger today about protecting that agricultural land than they did in the 1970s. And we certainly know, Honourable Speaker, that the conservation movement, that the environmental movement is strong today, just as it was in a growing movement in the 1970s. And the other thing that's similar from history, if we're comparing again history to today's context, is that we know that the pressures that existed in 1970 for development are even greater today. That the pressure around industrial use is much greater today than it was in 1973. So given all of that, Honourable Speaker, given that the purpose is just as important, given that the public is just as supportive, and given that the pressure is great, if not greater, to remove land, what would be the purpose of this bill that's coming forward, Honourable Speaker? What is the purpose of Bill 24? Come back to those questions that I talked about at the start. What is this bill looking to fix? What is this bill looking to improve? Well, Honourable Speaker, one of the first places that I would look in wondering why a bill's been brought forward and what its purpose is to the people who would be impacted by that bill. So if a bill was coming forward, I would look at the stakeholders, I would look at the interested parties, I would look at perhaps people who've worked in this field, I would look at people, no pun intended, Honourable Speaker, people who work in the area. That would be one of the first places when you're bringing forward a piece of legislation that I would think the government certainly would have taken the time to do. They would have taken the time to talk about it with the people who work in the field. That they would have gone out and talked about the changes with farmers, with ranchers, with the public, with not-for-profit groups, with everyone involved in agriculture. Not to limit it, Honourable Speaker, just to give some examples of the areas that you would have imagined that government would, of course, have gone out and had that discussion with. But guess what, Honourable Chair? This government didn't do that. They didn't, in fact, go out. Just the opposite. This government decided that they'd bring forward this legislation without having a consultation process, without going out and discussing this issue with farmers, with ranchers, with people who work in the industry. They decided they'd just bring the legislation forward. They'd say mea culpa. We seem to see a lot of apologies. They'd say mea culpa. It's nothing to worry about. We're just going to move forward. It's good for you. Well, Honourable Speaker, that is at the base one of the big problems we see, one in a long list, but one of the big problems we see with the government on the other side, Honourable Speaker, is the lack of interest or the lack of engagement that we've seen with the public on critical bills such as this, a bill that has weathered governments of different political stripes since the 1970s, and yet here we are today with a government that tries to bring a bill in without any proper consultation. Well, in fact, Honourable Speaker, there was a huge opportunity for consultation, a perfect made opportunity for consultation called a provincial election, an opportunity where political parties of all stripes have the chance to be able to come forward, have the chance to be able to talk about issues that they feel are important, a chance to be able to put their agenda in front of the public. And yet we didn't see the government talking about these changes in the election. We didn't hear the government talk at all about making changes to the Agricultural Land Commission or the Agricultural Land Reserve. And it certainly makes you wonder, Honourable Speaker, about why that would be. Why the government wouldn't take the opportunity to bring this issue forward. They just decided all of a sudden after the election that this was something they wanted to do. It wasn't something that they thought about before the election. Well, that certainly leaves a very bad taste on behalf of the public when there was an opportunity to talk and be honest and upfront about these issues, and yet we didn't hear any discussion about any change to agricultural land in this province. And as I said, this is a pattern, Honourable Speaker, that we've seen with this government. It isn't simply Bill 24 that has been a problem for this government when it comes to public consultation. I mean, there is a long list of issues where this government has not done what they should do, what I consider just basic good government, which is talk to people impacted before you make a final decision. I could list things from ripping up contracts with employee groups to creating regulations for First Nations without telling the First Nations about them, to, of course, the HST, as we all know. You would think, given that list, Honourable Speaker, that this government, that the BC Liberals will have learned something. You would imagine that they would have taken a look and said, well, things didn't go so well for us on the HST, or things didn't go so well for us around that regulation we brought in without consulting with First Nations. Perhaps we should consult on something like Bill 24. Perhaps we've learned our lesson on this issue, and we'll actually take the time to go out and talk to the public. We won't, like we've done in other examples, bring something forward, tell the public about it, and pick up the pieces afterwards. Perhaps we'll do good government and consult. But, Honourable Speaker, I haven't seen that. There is no example of that in this bill. And that's precisely the reason you're seeing so many people speaking out, Honourable Speaker. That's precisely the reason you're seeing the public and others rise up around this issue. Because they're angry that they have not had the opportunity for a voice in Bill 24. They have not had the opportunity to speak about challenges that they think are major changes to something that they hold dear in British Columbia. So I want to take a few minutes, Honourable Speaker, to read some of those voices, because although the government didn't go out and take the time to consult, although the government didn't seem to think it was important, this side of the House does believe it's important, Honourable Speaker. We do believe that those public voices should be heard. And I believe it's important to read some of those in the record, Honourable Speaker, so that that public who are speaking out have the opportunity. Whether the government chooses to listen or not is up to the government, I suppose, Honourable Speaker. There's nothing we can do about that. But we can certainly read the voices out in hopes that someone on the other side will take some time to listen and take some time to recognize the real, genuine concerns that are coming forward from individuals. I'm not hearing from individuals, Honourable Speaker, that they're not interested in looking at the Agricultural Land Reserve. I'm not hearing from individuals that they're not interested in looking at the Commission and the structure of the Commission. In fact, people want to engage. They want to engage on this critical issue to our province, this critical issue to this generation and future generations. It's not that they don't want to be involved, it's that they haven't had an opportunity, Honourable Speaker. And now their opportunity is to try and have their voices heard while government tries to bring in a piece of legislation that shouldn't be introduced in this legislature without that kind of thorough consultation and without major changes. This bill should not be here because it does not support agriculture as the original bill was meant to do. So let's take a look at a couple of those organizations, Honourable Speaker. I want to start off with the BC Agriculture Association itself. It represents 14,000 of 20,000 British Columbia farm families, generates 96% of the farm gate receipts in British Columbia, and their chair stated, and I quote, "I think we're genuinely afraid that the changes will trump the well-being of agriculture and agricultural land." That's pretty clear, Honourable Speaker. That's not questioning, that's very concerned about the heart of the industry that this individual is coming from. The BC Cattlemen's Association, Honourable Speaker, and I quote, "We need to look at the importance of food security, not only for our province, but as an economic driver down the road." Now there's someone who's looking at agriculture with the importance that it needs to be, unlike what we see in Bill 24 that's come forward. What about the BC Food Systems Network, Honourable Speaker? And again, I quote, "The split into 2 zones with the additional requirements added to the basic mandate for Zone 2, well, the intent seems to be to weaken the primary focus on agriculture." Weaken the primary focus on agriculture. Well, Honourable Speaker, if the purpose of the Agricultural Land Commission bill was to support agriculture, then I suppose the Agriculture Land Commission Amendment Act is to weaken agriculture, is to take apart the focus on agriculture. And Honourable Speaker, that's certainly not what I expected would be introduced in this legislature. Let's take a look at another group and organization, very committed, again to the issue of agriculture. The Pacific Regional Society of Soil Science. They say, and I quote, "The reduced role of science as the basis for protecting farmlands within the ALR is deeply troubling." So, Madam Speaker, we have deeply troubling. We have worrisome. We have individuals who work in the industry coming forward and talking about their concerns and trying to get this government to listen. There's a letter from 100 academics sent directly to the Premier. I quote again from the letter. "Agricultural lands produce not just crops, but contain wetlands, streams, ponds, riparian areas, woodlands, hedgerows, uncultivated grasslands, either adjacent to or integral to farm operations." Again, here's a group of scientists writing directly to the Premier, expressing their concern about what Bill 24 will do to their livelihood and to their passion. And I think that's important to state, Honourable Speaker, is that people who work in the area of agriculture certainly don't work in that area for money. It's not an area where there are huge dollars being made by most farmers in British Columbia. Most people are into farming because of family history and because they care deeply about the industry. They care deeply. You hear people, and I'm sure, Honourable Speaker, all members of this House have spent time talking to people who work in the agriculture area, or people who are running large and small farms, who will talk about the feel of dirt in their hands, who will talk about the joy that they get from being in the outdoors, from producing. And it really is a joy and a passion that I think is important to acknowledge. So when we see these kinds of quotes coming forward, when we see these kinds of comments coming forward, Honourable Speaker, they aren't simply coming forward because an individual happened to see a bill coming forward in the legislature, Bill 24, and decided, well, I better put something down on paper. It's coming from the heart from these farmers. It's coming from the heart from people who work in the agriculture industry, who care so deeply about this issue. I want to read a couple of quotes from the public that have also been coming in, Honourable Speaker. Because again, as I said, I think that's part of the real challenge that we see in this bill coming forward, is the lack of public involvement and engagement. And this quote actually came in from someone who lives in an urban setting. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the time I have, Honourable Speaker, because I think there are people who think that the only people who are going to stand up and talk about agriculture are people who come from the country, people who come from rural areas, people who come from other parts of British Columbia. Well, I grew up, Honourable Speaker, in Victoria from the age of 5, and I care deeply about agriculture. This is not an issue simply for folks who come from other parts of British Columbia. This is just as important to urban settings when it comes to food security, when it comes to the life of our community, when it comes to natural, healthy food. Agriculture is just as important. So this quote says, "So much of our food is transported from many miles away, but thanks to the ALR, we have access to fresh, locally grown food. Please don't take that away. I believe the ALR is a treasure that helps to safeguard land that will quickly be developed so that all of our food will have to be trucked in. Please think before you make this happen." And Honourable Speaker, I think that voice is so important to take a look at. The reason that this bill is so worrisome is it takes away that provincial oversight. It gives the opportunity to regions to make individual regional decisions. And the whole point of protecting agricultural land, Honourable Speaker, is having that provincial oversight, knowing that that provincial body is there to take a look, yes, listen to the regions, yes, hear the voices that are coming forward, but to say that this is a provincial good, just as our public health care system and our public education system, our agricultural system in British Columbia is a rich of all of us. It belongs to all of us in British Columbia. And it is critical to all of us in British Columbia that we see it protected. And so, Honourable Speaker, the easy thing for this government to do would be withdraw this legislation and do the proper consultation that needed to occur. We will remember that this legislature used to talk about introducing legislation as a draft for discussion and then giving an opportunity for the public to have a say and bringing it back in the fall. Now, there weren't a lot of things that I agreed with the former Premier, Premier Campbell, on, but that was one of them.
Thank you, member.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker.